Now that we've gone through the basic fundamentals of the perfectly competitive market, we'll be able to modify this model for the three market systems in which the firm has price-making power that ranges from some to significant. These include monopolistic competition, oligopoly, and monopoly. In this video, we'll begin with the last of these. Monopoly is the opposite extreme from perfect competition. Rather than many producers of homogeneous products, we'll find that there is one dominant firm that establishes the price for the market. To explore monopoly, we need to first lay out its assumptions. First of all, as we have already learned, firms that fall under the category of alternative market structures are price makers. Monopolists are the ultimate price makers. Another way of thinking of this is to say that they're price leaders. They choose a price and others follow. This is to say the monopoly firm may not be the only firm in the industry, but they are extremely dominant. It would be rare, although not impossible, for a monopoly to have 100% market share. Oftentimes, governments, for the purposes of antitrust, might set the boundary at something like 60% market share. Regardless, we simply need to understand that when there is a monopoly, there is a single dominant firm, and it's this dominance that makes it a monopoly. Next, we want to look at the product itself. What is the monopolist selling? Within a monopoly market structure, we would find that there's no close substitutes to what the monopoly firm is providing. There are several reasons for this, and they all can largely be categorized by the idea that there are significant barriers to entry. These include economies of scale, which we previously defined as the portion of the long-run average total cost curve where a firm experiences falling average costs due to larger and larger amounts of output being produced. There may also be a branding appeal to consumers, where a company like Nike has cornered the market on athletic shoes. Often this is associated with the ability of the firm to spend vast sums of money on marketing. There may also be legal barriers, such as high regulation in the medical equipment industry that means only a single firm can meet the requirements. Finally, the firm may be acting aggressively towards competition. It can do so by drastically cutting prices to where a competing firm will no longer be profitable. The monopoly firm can essentially outlast competition. They can advertise extensively. Think about how commercials during the Super Bowl cost in the millions of dollars for 30 seconds of airtime. And if all else fails, they acquire. Hi there, Instagram. Hello, WhatsApp. Meet Facebook, your new corporate overlord. The most significant change that we find in the diagram for monopoly is that the demand curve of the firm has become the demand curve of the industry. It is downward sloping, and with no close substitutes, we might find that the monopolist has the advantage of a product that is relatively price inelastic. Therefore, we could draw the demand curve somewhat steeply. We can also see that the marginal revenue curve is separate from demand and average revenue. In fact, technically, its slope is twice that of demand. This suggests that when the price drops for the next unit that is sold, all previously sold units will also fall in price. What happens next, the marginal, precedes what is happening now, our average. We can see how once the demand curve enters its inelastic marginal revenue, once it enters its inelastic region, the marginal revenue becomes zero and then negative. The firm's not going to produce here, as this would result in falling total revenue. So to bring our discussion back to a producer that produces at profit maximization, let's take a look at all of our diagrammatic elements together. Here we have our demand or average revenue curve, our marginal revenue, which is now a separate curve, our marginal cost, and average total cost curve. The profit maximizing monopoly firm follows the same general rule. Produce where marginal cost is equal to marginal revenue, MC equal to MR. So what happens from here once we find this intersection is a little bit different than perfect competition. Clearly, average revenue and marginal revenue are not the same anymore. So once the profit maximizing quantity is established, you move vertically up from the marginal cost equal to marginal revenue intersection all the way to the demand or average revenue curve. This is the price that the monopolist will sell their product at, PE, in this diagram here. We can then calculate profit by looking at the average total cost at that quantity and price point. The blue shaded area represents the maximum profit available to this monopoly firm. Now, there are downsides to an industry being represented by one singular firm. We saw in the unit on market failure that there was some HL content on the idea of abuse of market power. This is what a monopoly can do. It may take advantage of its position to charge a higher price than would be available in perfect competition. In fact, what we can see is that because the firm is not producing at the market equilibrium quantity and price point, it lacks both productive and allocative efficiency. It's not producing at the minimum of its average total cost curve, thus lacks productive efficiency, and it's not being allocatively efficient as it's actually producing a quantity below that of perfect competition. It chooses to sell less because it can get more profit that way. Diving into the diagram a bit further, we can see that there's a sort of overwhelming amount of labels. Let's just deconstruct what this particular model is trying to show. On the left, we have a market that is allocatively efficient. We likely have multiple producers that are all charging the same low price, at least the lowest that the market is willing to bear. This gives us the allocative efficiency whereby marginal benefit is equal to marginal costs. This translates to producers being at the lowest point of the average total cost curve if this were perfect competition in the long run. However, that is not what is happening right in the right-hand diagram. Instead, the monopolist follows its own profit-maximizing output where marginal cost is equal to marginal revenue. This point allows them to charge PM, the price of the monopoly, and we can compare this to the price that would be charged in perfect competition, which is below it. Thus, we find an area of deadweight loss. We can also see that the surplus of consumers is sacrificed to gain a surplus for the producers. We see these two different labels of C, S, and PS. So we can see why some governments seem to have it out for any industry with a whiff of monopoly power. It's an inefficient allocation of resources, and the consumers generally lose in order for producers to gain. I want to discuss one last thing in this video, and that is the concept of a natural monopoly. This situation occurs when a firm has economies of scale so large that it's possible for the single firm alone to supply the entire market, without there being an underproduction. This is possible because the monopolist has a lower average cost than two or more firms providing output to the industry. One way to understand this is to look at the long-run average total cost curve. We briefly saw when covering LRATC how sometimes a firm may have a curve that falls for almost any level of output. This often occurs with huge, and I'm saying it that way on purpose, huge startup costs. Example includes things like pipes for water delivery and sewage, roads, power lines, even your cable TV access. It just doesn't make a lot of sense to duplicate the incredibly high expenses for these things, and it might not even make sense to lay two brands of sewage pipes next to each other. How many times are we going to dig up roads for that? What we can note is that a natural monopoly may actually be preferable to perfect competition as the consumers are not as harmed. Natural monopolies also may not last forever as new technologies emerge. Cable TV is dying at the hands of streaming, and there are dozens of options in that marketplace.